if the only people allocating capital to the future are white men, we're fucked. But when we talk about new Palo Alto, we're not talking about another Palo Alto. We're talking about a different Palo Alto, and one that is intentional and is based on values. Because, yeah, the talent is completely equally distributed. And of course, there's plenty of talent in New Palo Alto. The idea that the only talent in the world is a 20-minute car ride from Sand Hill Road is like literally tells you how delusional Silicon Valley is.
That is Saul Klein. Saul is the co-founder of the ecosystem of funds under the umbrella Phoenix Court. The flagship fund, Local Globe, has invested in over 13 unicorns at seed stage, putting him number one in the EMEA region. Saul is a bit of a legend in the startup world, having invested early in the likes of Wise, UiPath, Robinhood, and having operated at Skype and co-founded Film. Additionally, he serves at the UK Prime Minister's Advisory Board of Science and Technology. I had the most inspiring conversation with Saul. We talked about his upbringing in South Africa during the apartheid years and how this experience instilled in him the ambition to leverage innovation to create a more equal world. We talked about how young people can get involved into the massive technological shifts that are happening today. This is the Venture Lab podcast, and I'm your host, Luis.
Ladies and gentlemen, by way of introduction.
If someone has no idea who you are, which is rather unlikely, and this person has just clicked on this conversation, can you give me a little bit of an overview on what you have spent the last 25 years of your career focusing on?
Wow, only 25 years, we're cutting it short. I
Was it
started
more?
like 34 years ago, but I guess what I would say, and I've said this, I think since 2008 on my Twitter account, or now X account, is
Yeah.
that, I've always just had 5 words to describe who I am and what I do. Number one, husband. Number two, father. Number three, founder. Number four, operator. And number five, investor. And I mean, honestly, those final three, founder, operator, investor, I've switched the order at different times since 2008 because, I always find myself playing all of those three roles,
Yeah.
but husband, father, founder, operator, investor, and my location, also since 2008, because on your Twitter profile they ask you what your location is.
Yeah.
I've always said internet.
So it means that you have a fascination for technology. Like where did this come from?
I honestly think, we all have a fascination for technology on some level. I'm definitely, I've ironically, as someone who's been on the UK Prime Minister's Council for Science and Technology for the last 5 years, during which time there have been 4 prime ministers in the UK and 6 chancellors. I'm neither a scientist nor a technologist. I started in this business, whatever this business is.
Yeah.
Like I said, you know, I guess the foundational point for me is the internet. So that's the way I think of the business since 1993. So, like, this is my 32nd year. So this is over half my life. I'm going to be 55 in October, and it's all of my professional life. So I'm not a didn't train as a technologist. I didn't train as a scientist. Didn't even train as a social scientist. I'm a humanities graduate.
Okay.
So I studied literature at college. And, in my final 2 years of high school, because in the UK, you pick 3 or 4 subjects to sort of specialize in,
Mm.
the topics that I focused on, or the subjects, my 3 subjects were English literature, history, and Latin.
Oh, wow.
So all of those 3 things and my degree in English literature, prepared me very well for a career in science, technology, and innovation,
Yeah,
and obviously in investing, because I've got everything I learned at school and at university was all about finance. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. No,
not.
I get that from it. But like, what kind of advantages that this different background that you have in school and also university, what advantages did that bring to you, like later on?
Look, I don't think as maybe different, if you like, as that might sound for someone who's worked in technology and
Mm.
science and innovation and finance for as long as I have. The reality is there are lots of people who are part of this industry who have, very similar backgrounds. My former partner and friend at Index Ventures, who we first met, I want to say 93. No, 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 no. Sorry, let me get this right. 95, probably. So this is 30 years ago. Danny Reimer, who is, a phenomenal investor at Index.
Mm.
Danny was a history of art major at Harvard. Mike Moritz, before he was an investor, was a journalist at Time Magazine, and he wrote a brilliant book in the early 90s, sorry, early 80s, rather, about Apple before he became an investor. Reed Hoffman, who, amazing entrepreneur and investor, was did symbolic systems at Stanford, but he did a master's in philosophy. So, look, the way I would sort of think about this simply is if technology and science have widespread impacts on society, and I think that was always the case,
Mm.
but is very much the case these days, then one doesn't just need to take a scientific or a technological or an engineering
Yeah,
lens. You have to take a human lens, because otherwise innovation doesn't serve society.
yeah,
And if it doesn't serve society, what's the point?
yeah. And do you think this is something that has changed over time? Because to me, it appears that like these days, like the majority of people in as entrepreneurs, also in venture, probably have this background in engineering, finance, and less in humanities or languages, for instance.
Don't know if that's the case, but again, I think, we're looking, you're talking about a very narrow window of innovation. I mean,
Mm.
arguably, let's say that modern venture capital started in the early 1970s with, the invention of the microprocessor, and
Yeah,
Intel and Fairchild Semiconductor, was sort of the earliest sort of venture capital investments in the early 70s. And that was very much obviously about sort of science and engineering. And if you look at the 70s, the 80s, what I would describe as the first era of modern venture capital, let's say it
yeah,
started in 1971 and it ended in 1994, when Netscape
yeah,
IPO'd. That first wave of venture was very much about science, engineering. If you think about the big companies that were created in that era, like Intel,
mm.
like Apple, really an engineering company, Cisco, that was an era where 80% of the the massive successes were kind of hard tech, or
Mm.
science,
Yeah.
if you like, and a small minority of the massive successes were software, like Microsoft or
Yeah.
Oracle. Maybe it was 80-20
Mm.
science and software. The next era of of venture capital, where which we're really living in the dividends of that era, although some of the first era companies like Microsoft and Apple are still just incredibly important.
Yeah.
But the next era was probably more like 80% or 90% software and 10% science. The Googles, the
Mm.
Metas, the Airbnbs, the Ubers, the Netflixes of this world. And I think that era ended with COVID. And I think we're now in the third era of venture, where it's kind of 50-50 science and software, but also the impact of science and software is sort of socially ubiquitous. When I was at Microsoft, when I joined Microsoft in when from a spin out from MIT, we got acquired, I think in like 95, something like that.
Mm.
Maybe there were 70 million people on the internet. 70 million. Today, fast forward like 30 years, there are like 6 billion people on the internet. So, you can't operate, in my view, in the innovation system if you don't have a strong balance between science, software, and as Steve Jobs sort of famously demonstrated, at the intersection of the arts and the
Yeah.
sciences. And I think there is a reason why Apple is the most valuable company in the world and is still around, even though it got started in that first era by science and engineering, is because they fused these ideas that, design mattered,
Yeah.
like how people use technology matters, versus like, oh, it's cool, we'll find a use for it.
Yeah. And I always think that people are very much shaped by their early life experience. So I'm wondering which early experience had the strongest impact on you, on what you're doing today, and also that kind of shaped those views that we just talked about.
I know it's a good question, because I think, one's influences are multiple. So I
Yeah.
think, everything that we've just spoken about probably was less fundamental as a shaping experience to me than growing up for the first 6 years of my life
Mm.
and not really realizing it until afterwards in apartheid South Africa.
Yeah.
So, you know, when my parents decided to leave South Africa in 1976, I was 6 years old. I didn't know what the society was that we were leaving. I didn't really understand the society
Yeah.
that it was that we were going to in London and the UK. I mean, obviously, as a teenager, and then as I grew up as an adult, and obviously going back to South Africa, even in those apartheid years
Yeah.
before Mandela was released, there was just this sense of like, oh my God, this is like so unfair. And I think, what I've really, I would say, spent the last 10 years of my life, professionally and
Mm.
personally, being very focused on, which is not necessarily something, in fact, it's not something I learned in the Valley,
Mm.
is this notion of trying to facilitate and support more equal outcomes.
Yeah.
Because I think the legacy of the Silicon Valley mindset, is a legacy of unequal outcomes at an extraordinary level of inequality. And, this is something that, I think I sensed in my 20s and 30s, but really only in my 40s and 50s have I sort of focused on, moving away from and trying to sort of think much more honestly and systematically about inequality and the role that innovation plays in either reinforcing inequality
Yeah.
or addressing inequality. And I think, when people ask me like what motivates you from that side, I think really that probably goes back to that sort of very formative experience of being born in a society that was fundamentally politically, legally unequal.
Did you perceive this already once you came to like the UK and once you moved? Because you said you were six, so probably it was more in hindsight, right? That you actually start like
Yeah.
perceiving those differences.
Look, I know that my parents, and they would talk about this, wanted us, me and my sister, to live and grow up in a society that was more equal,
Mm.
where even from the point of view of, I mean, South Africa in the 70s and the 80s was subject to political, economic, and cultural boycotts.
Yeah.
So, even having access to, progressive materials like
Mm.
literature, thinking, like you couldn't read Marx. No,
Yeah.
you couldn't, right? TV only existed in the year that I left in 1976 because the government wanted to control the
Yeah.
way that information, was received by the population. So, on one level, my parents were saying, like, we just don't want you to grow up in a society where information is being controlled, you don't have access to knowledge and education that, at least in Europe or in America, people would have taken for granted. And then also, this is just a fundamentally unfair society.
Yeah.
So, that can't not have an impact on you. So I didn't really understand any of that at the time, but
Mm.
that was definitely would have been part of the conversation at home. And, kids are smart. I've got three kids, they know what's going on, even if adults, often treat kids like they
Yeah.
don't understand. And, I mean, I don't know if you have kids, but it's even as kids are learning from the moment they're born and they're smart, they know what's happening. So I think you assimilate some of these thoughts later, but these were definitely, if you're asking about, I think, formative experiences, that there was that. And then I also grew up in a household, where being an entrepreneur was not something that wasn't on the table. In fact, my dad was an entrepreneur, my grandfather on my mother's side was an entrepreneur. So
Yeah.
said when I was 23, I wanted to leave a kind of a sort of a normal profession, and I wanted to go off and join a startup in the spin out from MIT. My parents weren't, what the fuck are you talking about? They're
Yeah.
like, okay, go for it.
Yeah. But it's also great to hear that they weren't pushing towards this, right? Because you also started off your career in a different industry that was not necessarily related to the startup environment.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think when I left university, with a non-vocational degree, English, literature,
Yeah.
it was at a time in the early 90s when, at least in the UK, the economy was terrible. Graduates really couldn't find work very easily, and certainly
Mm.
graduates who didn't have like a law degree or an accounting degree or a
Yeah.
profession like, architecture or engineering. So, I had no obvious place to
Mm.
go work. So, I ended up first at a newspaper, The Telegraph, and then at an advertising agency, Ogilvy's. Um, but I learned very quickly that even traditional organizations in traditional industries need to be entrepreneurial if they are
Yeah.
going to evolve.
Yeah.
So, I don't feel that large or traditional organizations can't be entrepreneurial. And actually, I learned really great lessons in those first few years about, what does it take within a more traditional business to be
Mm.
entrepreneurial? Because I was allowed to be entrepreneurial both at the Telegraph, where we created the world's first internet newspaper a week before the San Jose Mercury News. And, at Ogilvy's and WPP, where we were, again, putting brands onto the internet and on interactive TV, when you still couldn't even, display an image on a browser.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine for me, like growing up
No,
in a very
it's like
different.
impossible to imagine,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. I think we've already touched on this because you strike me as a person that is on a very clear mission. So because I get this energy that there's something that you kind of dedicate your work towards. And what would you say is this mission that you are on?
Look, I think it changes, and I think, I always try and reflect on, why I'm doing what I'm doing. As I said, the way I would articulate it hasn't changed since
Mm.
2008. I try never to forget that before anything that I'm doing professionally, I'm first a husband and second a father.
Yeah,
I'm a son, I'm a brother, I'm try to be a good friend, and it's really hard to like particularly in this innovation economy, which is
yeah,
so exciting and future looking and
yeah,
seems to move at this incredible pace, but actually moves over decades and centuries. It's very hard to like pause and reflect. So, I try not to lose sense of important priorities.
yeah,
Um, but I think definitely in the last 5 or 10 years, I've had a much clearer sense of professionally what I'm trying to do. And then as an organization, at Phoenix Court, we've really, I think, put a lot of emphasis and effort into understanding and articulating for ourselves, at least, because I think it has to start with your own
yeah,
organization, what our purpose is and what our values are. And, that is the sort of the core of how we think and how we operate and how we behave. So, we describe our purpose, which is, I think, you know, is an odd purpose maybe for a venture capital
mm,
firm, is to be a good long-term neighbor and to help people realize their full potential. And, what does that actually mean? It means something in terms of how we think about our team, like being a good long-term neighbor and helping people realize their full potential, and how we behave towards one another. It obviously, is about how we work with founders and their teams, and how we try and, support them and their in realizing their full potential.
yeah,
But I think most maybe different from what many other people might expect is, these aren't words in our business. We've baked this into the economics of our business by allocating 10% profits in our management company, 2% of carry in each of our funds, and then also 10% of the management company to our foundation, which we call Phoenix Court Works.
yeah,
And then 80% of the grants that our foundation makes go within a mile of our office. And so being a good long-term neighbor and helping people realize their full potential is very focused on our physical neighborhoods.
Yeah.
And the reason why we've done that, you asked me where I'm based, on the one side of our office, people who've been to London would know St. Pancras because, that's where the Eurostar goes to Paris and
Yeah.
Brussels and Amsterdam. They'd know King's Cross because that's how you go to Cambridge and Edinburgh and Glasgow, or Hogwarts if you want to go from platform 9 3/4. And then on the other side of our office is Euston, which is, the train to Manchester and
Mm.
Birmingham, etc. And, if you think about any city in the world, the poorest neighborhood, whether it's in, Dusseldorf or Santiago or Calcutta, will be next to mass transit.
Yeah.
And if you have the 3 points of mass transit for, 150, 200 years, this neighborhood that is sort of stuck in between them, Somerstown, which is where we're based, is still one of the poorest neighborhoods in London and in the UK. So if you're an adult who lives in this neighborhood, you'll live 20 years less than, the neighborhood I live in Golders Green and Highgate,
Yeah.
which in a G7 economy is unforgivable. But by the way, this is not the only city in the world that has that level of inequality.
Mm.
And so, when we talk about being a good long-term neighbor, it goes back to this point about how do you use innovation to sort of shorten the distance and reduce inequality, health inequality, education inequality, economic inequality,
Yeah.
because like otherwise, what's the point?
So you decided also to go there to have the impact on the very physical environment, and then probably also with the companies that you invest in is like the more on the macro scale to like pursue this idea of creating or releasing the full potential of people.
Yeah, but also being a good long-term neighbor.
Yeah.
So, I would say that my observation, which I don't think is a novel observation, is that, entrepreneurs who end up having outsized impact, are missionary. They're not
Yeah.
mercenary. It may be that even on their mission, there are unintended consequences, if I'm being generous, that they
Mm.
may not have thought of at the beginning.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, my sort of rational versus emotional bet
Mm.
on this mission is that a mission like this means you attract and retain a team that has very strong purpose,
Yeah.
very strong values. And I think, we've got a team of 30 people who hopefully really manifest those values.
Yeah.
Secondly, you attract founders who are attracted to having like a positive impact on the world, not for the sake of having an impact,
Yeah.
but because if they are successful, they will have a positive impact. And
Yeah.
then finally, it also means that the LPs or the investors in our funds, it's very important to us that they are aligned to these values as well. And that we are clear, if we are successful in investing in founders who are successful and therefore generate returns
Yeah.
for our LPs and ourselves, because the founders have built these great companies, that the beneficiaries of these returns, are value aligned. So, for example, if we have a Danish pension fund as investors
Yeah.
that represents nurses in Denmark, I know two things. One, if we are successful, the beneficiaries are nurses.
Yeah.
Great. I also know that, for better or for worse, 90% of nurses are women. So again, not only are nurses benefiting, but it is more skewed towards women benefiting than
Yeah.
not. Because again, this is about improving the equality of outcomes. If you look at the innovation system, the major beneficiaries of the innovation system since 1970s have been white men.
Yeah.
I've got nothing against white men. I am one. But it doesn't mean that that is even close to improving the equality of distribution.
I am really impressed by the vehicle that you created that actually like attracts what you just explained, like-minded people. And you already mentioned Phoenix Court, and I wanted to ask, could you like give us a brief introduction to like what you're doing at Phoenix Court and how it is composed?
You mean other than being a good long-term neighbor and helping people
Exactly.
realize their full potential?
Exactly.
That doesn't cut it for you.
Let's get down to the action.
Specifics,
Yeah,
what we do. So
exactly.
yeah, so we've got, I mean, other than our foundation, Phoenix Court Works, we have our space, which is the group is named after Phoenix
Yeah,
Court, which is in Somerstown. We operate the space for our team, for the founders that we work with. It's used very actively by founders and their teams, but also by, some of the 35 plus local organizations that we work
yeah,
with in the neighborhoods, the schools, the
yeah.
doctors' surgeries, the youth center, etc. So that's Phoenix Court Works, the foundation. Phoenix Court is the space. And then I guess you want me to talk about the funds that we
Let's do
invest
it a little
in.
bit, and after we can come back to the storytelling garden, for instance.
Okay, so yeah, the funds. So, probably the fund that we are best known for in the last 20 years is a fund called Local Globe. I mean, to put Local Globe in perspective, there are 3,800 active VCs in Europe, Middle East, and Africa, EMEA.
Yeah,
I think um, 0.8% of those VCs have invested in more than 5 unicorns at seed. 0.8% have
yeah,
invested in more than 5 unicorns at seed in EMEA. We've invested in 13 unicorns at seed in EMEA. That puts us number one on that list of 3,800 VCs active in EMEA. So, for example, while we've done 13 at seed in EMEA, Axel has done 3,
wow,
or Sequoia's done 6. Now, granted, they are specializing at Series A versus seed. So that fund is Local Globe, which invested pre-seed and seed. We then have created in 2018 a sister fund called Latitude, that invests at what we call the breakout stage. So, this is when products have kind of, or companies have really kind of are breaking out.
okay,
Typically a sort of a Series B, Series
mm,
C, rounds of 15 to 100 million. And then we piloted in 2022 and now are sort of moving into fund one, a sort of a third fund called Solar. And that invests at the scale up stage. So, typically rounds of 100 million plus, where companies are 2 or 3 years away from being IPO ready.
yeah,
So, if you look at Local Globe, the job of Local Globe from our point of view, or from our investors' point of view, is like be really good picking unicorns at seed,
going
you
well.
know, going well.
Yeah,
But don't rest on your laurels. We're not in a European market anymore that no one is
mm,
is excited about. So, we can't lose our edge. Then we are focused with Latitude and Solar in what we would call concentrating capital in the companies that are breaking out, Latitude,
yeah,
or scaling up. And if I look at the sort of the cohort, the active cohort of companies that are at that stage, and we would define that stage as doing over 25 million in revenue, 25 to 100 million in revenue, we
Yeah.
call a cult. 100 million in revenue plus, we call a thoroughbred. Unicorns are just about valuation, colts and thoroughbreds are about revenue. So we have 46 companies in our portfolio that are doing over 25 million in revenue. We've got 26 that are doing over 100 million in revenue. And we have even 11 fintechs that are doing over 100 million in revenue. So, what we're doing with Local Globe, Latitude, and Solar is giving ourselves the opportunity to, pick as early as humanly possible. And
Yeah.
by the way, of those 46 companies doing over 25 million in revenue, I think over 60% we invested in at seed, and 75% are in this 5-hour train ride from King's Cross we call New Palo Alto.
Yeah.
So, what we want to do, and I think Wise is probably one of the great examples of this, is, we want to invest in a company at seed stage, as
Mm.
we did with Wise, and just keep investing, at Latitude, which we did, and at Solar, which we
Yeah.
did. So, my view is even if you are a year or two, I mean, quite frankly, even if you are public, you can still be early. So if I look at, some of the personal investments I've made, for example, I invested in Netflix in 2002
Oh, that's
because I was
early.
competing against Netflix at Love
Yeah.
Film. I knew they were a really good company. I haven't touched that stock
Mm.
in 23 years. And I think it's been a 300 plus X.
Yeah.
I bought Salesforce in 2003. I bought Tencent in 2008. It's like if you'd bought Amazon in 2003, 2001, 3 or 4 years after it'd gone public, you'd have a 20,000x. So every dollar you put in,
Yeah.
then it would be worth 20,000 plus dollars today. So to me, early is a state of mind.
Yeah.
It's not a stage. It's like all about, and we want to be in a position where if we are lucky enough to work with a founder who we met at seed stage, just because their company is public, it doesn't mean they've reached their full potential.
Yeah.
So we've created with Local Globe, Latitude, and Solar funds, a fund family that allows us to keep
Yeah.
following the breakouts, the scale ups all the way for as long as we like. And then we have a fourth vehicle, which currently is just from our own balance sheet, that we call Basecamp. And Basecamp is a community of micro VCs, solo GPs, people like us,
Yeah.
20 years ago when we started out as angels,
Yeah.
23 years ago. And, we are an angel LP in around 70 of those,
Well.
45% in the US, 45% in EMEA, 10% in APAC. So if you think about the private markets, there are 150,000 venture-backed companies that are still alive globally. It's really hard to pick signal from the noise.
Yeah.
We start with Local Globe as number one in EMEA, picking signal from noise, i.e., picking unicorns at seed. And on a look through basis, as it's called
Yeah.
by LPs, our angel fund of funds, Basecamp, is number 4 globally picking unicorns at seed. So theoretically, that should make the job of latitude and solar a lot easier if you are picking from this
Yeah.
super high signal to noise ratio. There are around 13,000 companies we have in our pipeline, and obviously in the last decade, we've built software. Now we can use machine learning and AI to sort of improve our insights. And we have a software platform, we call it Nazare, which
Okay.
is the biggest wave in the world
Yeah, it's beautiful.
because, we are, picking the surfers who can ride the biggest waves over multiple decades. And so, we have these four funds: Local Globe, Latitude, Solar. We have Basecamp,
Yeah.
and then Nazare pulls it all together as a tool for our team to kind of support our picking and our
Yeah.
capital concentration.
I wanted to ask like to the effect of cross-pollination among those different companies, but I think you already answered it. Or is there anything that you would add to like how each entity positively affects the other by the ecosystem that you created?
Look, I think the only thing that can cause positive cross pollination is a team that, is well integrated and works well together.
Yeah.
So, we emphasize both in the design of our space, the fact that we treat and compensate investors and operators in the same level.
Yeah.
Everyone in the firm, from front of house to managing partners, get carry, get profit share in the management company. Everyone participates in and is able to participate in the investment process. Everyone on the investment team, we got 15 people who are investors, if you
Yeah.
like, can lead deals. So we back people's conviction. And we obviously give support through we call small teams. We
Mm.
play something that my partner George wrote about in the last couple of weeks, what we call total football, which is just people can swap
Yeah.
positions, people, it's about working well together. So I think, none of this works unless people work well together,
Yeah.
and you invest heavily in sort of values, culture. We have what we call a progression framework that's, we invest heavily in, which is helps people sort of support their professional development. We provide coaching. We created the Newton program 5 years ago
Yeah.
with London Business School. So, we take, like I said, helping people to realize their full potential really seriously, and we take
Yeah.
being a good long-term neighbor really seriously. So being a good neighbor is the investment team working well with the operations team. Being a good neighbor is like if you know something about AI infrastructure and a company comes in fintech that
Mm.
is, targeting infrastructure, you work with that person.
Yeah.
So and then obviously with software and with data, we've also invested very heavily in infrastructure
Yeah.
to support not just collaboration, but helping people see connections that they may not see. And obviously, this is where machine learning is just like
Yeah.
next level, is that, there are certain things that software can do that improves your productivity. There are things that machines can do that can see patterns that humans can't.
Yeah.
So, this is what we've done with our software. We don't make a big deal about it because it's just part of our operating muscles.
Yeah.
But it's sort of, we think of Nazare as a team member.
I come from a background in architecture, and I always approach it more from a humanities standpoint. And then this setup that, or the ecosystem that you created, reminds me very much of different moments in the history of art, where it was exactly about this idea of fluidity between different industries and the idea of cross-pollination. Like, I mean, just for instance, the Renaissance with the attempt to combine arts and humanities, or also the Bauhaus, where it
Yeah.
was about creating a universal design language within the different industries. And I was curious, have you ever been inspired or looked at those movements outside the business environment that kind of, yeah, when you set up this whole your own conglomerate?
Yeah, look, and honestly, going back to what did I learn at school and university, I'm probably more predisposed to think about the history of arts and culture, and the role that technology and innovation has played in all of this. Like, I've always seen art and science as being interdependent with society, politics, and the economy.
Yeah,
And that's why I don't think that what we've been experiencing in the last 50 to 60 years is anything particularly new. And we've always been working at the intersection of the arts and the sciences, and true innovation has always been with, if you look at Isaac Newton, for example, he was a scientist, but he was also an alchemist.
yeah,
If you look at Darwin, if you look at Oppenheimer, if you look at Da Vinci, all of
mm,
these people are what, we would call polymaths.
yeah,
And it's, a relatively recent phenomena, and actually a mistake, in my view, to over specialize.
yeah.
And you talk about architecture. One of the most interesting companies in our portfolio, they do lab automation. They're called Automata.
Okay.
Um, and the founders they met working for Zaha Hadid, who you would know. One of the world's great, well, 50 years great architects.
Mm,
And yes, they worked in in innovation group in her practice. But when
yeah,
you ask Mustafa, what is it that makes you the right CEO of a lab automation company that is hardware, software, robots?
yeah,
And he's like, what does an architect do? It's like they bring people from different disciplines together to
yeah,
work on a project that people can live in and use. I mean, we work really closely now, with Thomas Heatherwick. We backed him in a new business, and
yeah,
we're always looking for the sort of the interdisciplinary dimensions of building organizations, building teams that respect and integrate multidisciplinary thinking. I mean, many years ago, when Quora was just getting started, I wrote a post on Quora, which at one time was like actually one of the top posts on Quora. This is how long ago it was, about a platonic startup. What were the sort of the skills that would be
yeah,
needed in a platonic startup? And I said, you need product, i.e., like someone who can make something. You need someone who can understand the people you are making the stuff for.
yeah,
And like, you can call that product marketing, you could call it sales, whatever. And at least you need those those two skills, and
yeah,
very few people have those two skills. And then there was a third skill I think I had around operations, just people who can like build the underlying operations of the business, just
yeah,
so the people making stuff and figuring out who you're making it for can get on with their job. Like,
yeah,
you know do we have an office? Do we have money to like pay people's salaries and cover our rent? How do we pay our suppliers' bills? So the archetypes are important, but unless the archetypes respect one another and
Mm.
what they bring to the table, and I learned this very early on, when I was at Microsoft in the 90s, is that, if you have a fundamental disrespect between engineering and sales, for
Yeah.
example. I even learned this at the Telegraph between editorial and sales. You're just going to have a toxic culture and you're going to be unproductive.
So the reason for me to start this podcast was that I experienced the industry of venture capital as quite gate-kept, and I felt a deep dissatisfaction with it, and I decided to channel it into this creative outcome, which then resulted in the podcast. And because I thought when I'm experiencing this issue, I thought there are other people experiencing it as well. And so the idea is to create value and to give people access to this space. And I know that you are very passionate about the topic as well, and we talked about it already. What would you think would be ways to make venture more accessible, like once on a macro level and on a micro scale?
Look, I think there are two things that I've tried to do, well, three things maybe, in the last 15 years. Okay, now I'm thinking more, four on this topic. The first is in 2007, I created something called Open Coffee Club. And the idea there was, as you said, like, venture capital offices are impossible to get into. How do you get a meeting?
Yeah,
If you do get a meeting, it's a pitch, it's really, transactional, and
yeah,
you don't really get to know people or understand them. So I thought, okay, what if, once a week on a Thursday at the same time in this place in
yeah,
London, anyone who wanted to talk to me or other people involved in startups could just come along. And, it went really well. We had loads of people show up week
yeah,
one. And I'm like, actually, wouldn't it be nice if I was somewhere else on a Thursday? I don't know, like Amsterdam or
yeah,
Manchester or New York. I could also go to an open coffee club. It's like I'm Jewish, like going to a synagogue, or, if you're Christian,
yeah,
going to a church, or if you're Muslim, going to a mosque. You
yeah.
just know if I go to this certain place at this certain time, other people like
Yes,
me or will be around.
yes,
And
cool.
then, we kind of created this effectively playbook like, hey, you want to open an open coffee club? Here's what you do. And,
Yeah,
before we knew it, there were like literally 300 of these chapters around the world. I remember actually
wow.
a year or two in doing a Zoom, or actually it was probably a Skype call in those
Yeah,
days with my an associate at Index at the time. She's now a brilliant partner at Spark. She led their Anthropic investment, but she was originally Iranian. And so the two of us, I mean, she helped me do a call for an open coffee club in one, I think it was the third largest city in Iran. So
yeah,
it kind of just like, for me, that was just part of, okay, how do we open the door,
yes,
basically? And so that was one thing. Round about that time, I worked with a journalist from the FT, and he spent a week with me in Estonia, in London, like, and then wrote a long piece for the FT magazine
yeah,
about like what goes on, behind closed doors. That was a long time ago. And then, obviously with Phoenix Court, we've created this sort of very open, porous, physical environment and
yeah,
network. And then, the other thing that I did 5 years ago, because I was very frustrated that, you know, venture capital was so lacking in diversity. and to learn venture capital, everyone would be like, oh, it's a craftsman's business. It's like it's a guild. It's like like all this like literally medieval language.
Yeah.
And this is the time when seven of the world's largest companies are venture backed. And I'm like, this makes no fucking sense. So like the most valuable companies in the world are have been financed by this sort of magic alchemy
Yeah.
of venture capital. And yet we still treat the art of venture capital as a medieval guild. And like, at least we should be in the fucking Renaissance at this
Yeah.
point. So
Exactly.
I created with London Business School the Newton for 21st century alchemists
Mm.
venture program. And the ambition was that by 2030, at least half of our cohorts would be from underrepresented backgrounds. 5 years on, we've had 5,000 people go through the program. 60% are from, the global majority.
Yeah.
And I think 49% are female. So, my view is that if the primary role of venture capital is to allocate capital to the future, like
Yeah.
20, 30 years from now, like the world we want to exist 20, 30 years from now, if the only people allocating capital to the future are white men, we're fucked.
Mm.
Or at least, at best, we're going to land up where we are with very smart, wealthy white men lining up next to Donald Trump telling us what the world's going to look like.
Yeah, because the opportunities, they're not distributed equal, because it's not, I mean, it's opposing that talent is, but then opportunity is not. So in that regard, I feel
No, and
like,
and capital allocation plays a massive role in that. And
yeah.
and this is why, in my view, educating capital allocators,
Mm.
not just VCs, but LPs as well, is absolutely critical because, we kind of get what we pay for.
Yeah.
And if we, not to say we haven't had incredible innovation dividends from Silicon Valley or
Yeah.
Palo Alto. But, when we talk about new Palo Alto, we're not talking about another Palo Alto. We're talking about a different Palo Alto,
Yeah.
and one that is intentional and is based on values. Because, yeah, the talent is completely equally distributed. And of course, there's plenty of talent in New Palo Alto. There's plenty of
Yeah.
talent, in Munich, in Milan, in Zurich, in
Yeah.
Slovenia, in Ukraine, in Bangalore, in Hong Kong, in Singapore, in Lagos, in Cape Town. I mean, the idea that the only talent in the world is a 20-minute, car ride from Sand Hill Road is like literally tells you
Yeah.
how delusional Silicon Valley is.
And what I'm wondering is that, like, it adds on this, that the venture landscape is restricted also to very few people that can invest and participate in early stage startups. How would it be possible to make investing into those companies accessible to a wider range of people? And do you think it would benefit startups and the greater public?
It's a great question. I mean, on some level, we in most economies have delegated investing either to the state or to our pension funds or to the insurance companies that we take policies out with. So we've kind of like delegated
Yeah.
agency to those three entities. And just in the UK, there is 6 trillion, not billion, £6 trillion sitting with insurance companies, pension funds, and in cash ISAs. So in savings,
Yeah.
long-term savings, or insurance policies. Less than 1% of that 6 trillion in the UK goes to our innovation economy, which happens to be the second or third best in the world. Now, you may say, like, what is going on? And you would be right. That is a profound disservice to citizens and savers
Yeah.
who are taking out those insurance policies, who've delegated authority over their pension savings. It is really not good.
Yeah.
And at the same time, because the private markets are so big, I mean, just look at the last week where you had a $30 billion private round, which is like 15 times bigger than the Alibaba IPO, which was already one of the biggest public rounds in the
Yeah.
last 20, 30 years. And then the place where people would have been able to make their own decisions about investing in innovation,
Yeah.
i.e., the public markets, is pretty much shut off. So, yeah, we're in a bad place right now because typically pension funds, insurance companies, and the state, and I say typically, there are definitely exceptions, but
Mm.
in the UK and in Europe, you are not good at this.
Yeah.
This goes back to investor literacy. So yeah, I'm a professional optimist, and also, this quite frankly has been the focus for me in the last 4 years of advice I've been giving in the UK to the now 4 different prime ministers, 6 different chancellors, is like, let's make some of that 6 trillion work on behalf of the British public.
Yeah.
And we'll get there because, the evidence at this point is like so obvious. But it starts with, as you sort of correctly have diagnosed, it starts with literacy. And if people don't understand, then we're not going to change very much. But I fully believe that retail investors, people, will have the ability to make their own choices, or they are going to start saying to their pension funds and to their insurance companies, we will start choosing who we
Yeah.
allocate our savings to and buying our policies from, for people who understand how to do this. Because, it's not like, for example, the Canadians, the Singaporeans, the Australians, the Americans, and, obviously there are exceptions. There are UK investors like the Wellcome
Yeah.
Trust or Baillie Gifford that know how to do this. There
Mm.
are, um, investors across the world that know how to do this. The problem is that, while we in the UK have one of the world's best innovation economies, and there are 800 venture-backed companies in the UK that are cults and thoroughbreds,
Yeah.
which is pretty impressive. Like, there's nowhere else in the world that has that number other than the Bay Area. And by
Yeah.
the way, that number is not to be competitive with Europe. France, Germany, Netherlands, and Sweden combined. So, the idea that we have £6 trillion not looking to invest in those companies, like falling over themselves to invest in those companies, to me is like nonsensical.
Yeah.
But it's a failure. Well, it's just a lack of literacy at this point. And the problem is less that those companies don't get money. The problem is that only 20% of the money that they get is domestic. So when they do well, and they do well, who benefits?
Mm.
A teacher in Ontario, a nurse in Denmark, the
Yeah.
Singapore metro system, or MBS. And if that's okay for, the British establishment,
Yeah.
I mean, all people like me can do is present the facts.
Yeah. And what would you recommend to young people that don't have a background in engineering, finance, or business and that want to join the venture industry? Like, what would you say to them?
Well, look, I think the reality is, like I said, technology is ubiquitous in society now. It's
Yeah,
like water or electricity. So you are involved. You're involved anyway. Like if you're using ChatGPT, if you're shopping on Amazon, if you
yeah,
use Instagram, you're involved. I mean, I've got 3 kids. They're all involved, not because of me, but because we all use technology.
yeah,
So the only question is, are you curious and do you want to be more involved? Not
yeah.
are you involved?
Yeah, I like that reframing of the question. And so we have a closing tradition on this podcast, which is called the open letter. So you can address a one sentence letter to a specific group of people. So, for instance, to your younger self, to your children, to your future entrepreneurs. Who would that be, and what would you say?
Okay, well, this is not very um general. It's quite
Okay,
specific, but I think
let's do
it,
it.
it's something that was one of the most memorable sentences that I heard in the last 2 weeks. I spent 3 days in Hong Kong, 2 days in Singapore, 2 days in Seoul, and three
Yeah,
days in Japan. And, my reflection was when you look at the infrastructure, the airports, the roads, the mass transit, the affordable housing, the healthcare systems, the education systems, and then, the strength of the science, technology, and innovation. My real sense was that, all of those places are living in a future that if we are lucky, well, in their present, they're living in a future we would be lucky to live in. And, we look around us and whether it's in Europe or even, I would say even more so, or as much so in the US, the infrastructure is crumbling or needs massive reinvestment, housing, education, healthcare, etc. I mean, we've still, fortunately in the UK and obviously, in other parts of Europe have strong innovation systems. But, we need to kind of wake up and realize um, some of these truths. And partly
yeah,
that is about being honest and it's about being curious. But the thing that really blew me away was meeting someone who was, at the cutting edge of AI. And we were talking about DeepSeek.
yeah,
Um, and obviously, DeepSeek has produced an open model that has 95% of the value of a closed model from OpenAI at 0% of the cost.
yeah,
Okay. And what I thought was so amazing about the takeaway that this guy had, and he's running like an incredible AI company
yeah,
where of the 3 founders, one of the founders was on the Transformer paper. Okay. So they're good, these
yeah,
guys.
yeah,
And they're not trying to build a foundational model. They're just trying to use the best models that are out there
yeah,
to build the best kind of solutions and applications for their
mm,
customers, who are governments and businesses, etc. And he said to me, like, I was asking him, like, what are your compute needs? Because, everyone you talk to in AI is like, we need more compute. We need more
yeah,
compute. We need more compute. And he said, on our job ads, we say we are GPU poor. I'm like, oh,
yeah,
that's that's like, that's strange. And here's my takeaway from this is what he said, what he meant is that when he talks to engineers from Meta and from Google and from OpenAI, all of
Yeah.
whom are applying to work at his business, they're entitled, and they see compute like massages at their desk or foosball tables. And what he wants are entrepreneurs, or engineers rather, who can work within constraints,
Yeah.
because when you work within constraints, that's how you innovate. And that was the deep seek insight. But it's also, you know, I think thinking about being GPU poor, Singapore also says we're a small country.
Yeah.
Just be humble. Don't be entitled, because constraints help you innovate. And I think, that is always worth remembering.
Yeah.
And I think, we are incredibly arrogant and we are incredibly entitled, and we can't afford to be anymore. So, my one liner for people would be GPU poor.
And then I will add the story behind so they understand the context of it.
Good.
So thank you so much for this conversation. It's incredibly inspiring for me to see how you humanitize venture capital, and also to see how you kind of create and see opportunities where others don't. But I think most importantly, what really struck me is that I really admire how deeply you care about people's well-being and also the positive impact that you're making. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And let's keep making this all open.